Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Amanda Young, and I am a research analyst at RTI International and a member of the Evaluation and Sustainability TTA project team. I will be your host for today. This is the Evaluation and Sustainability TTA webinar, assessing and enhancing cultural responsiveness in reentry programs through research and evaluation. This will be presented by Lama, Ada, and Monica. Before we get started, I'm going to review a few housekeeping items for you. If technical support is needed, please let us know through the chat pod. Shane is our technical host today and will be assisting with our polling questions and any additional technical needs. I also want to draw your attention to the live transcript button located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can use this feature to turn captioning services on and off. If you have questions for our presenters regarding today's material, please type them into the Q&A pod. We will have time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. And before I introduce our presenters and turn it over to them, I wanted to provide a friendly reminder that your Evaluation and Sustainability TTA coach is available to assist with more individualized work on the topic being presented today. If you have questions or thoughts on how to apply the content to your work, please feel free to reach out to your site coach or the ESTTA team. All right, I'll go ahead and introduce our presenters for today. Lama is a senior fellow at the Center for Court Innovation, and she leads research studies on a wide range of topics, including community supervision, reentry, and tribal systems. Lama is currently a doctoral candidate in developmental psychology and was instrumental in developing the corresponding cultural responsiveness brief. Ada is the president and CEO of American Indian Development Associates, LLC. She has 30 years of experience designing and managing culturally relevant research, evaluation, training, and technical assistance focused on tribal justice systems and programs. We have several tribal grantees represented here today, and we appreciate the opportunity to collaborate with Ada and leverage her expertise for this webinar. And Monica is a research analyst at RTI International. Among various projects, she's had experience working as a site coach, qualitative data interviewer, and logistics coordinator on projects focusing on criminal legal systems, reentry, and victim-centered projects. In addition to her work, she's involved in various equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives at RTI. Without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn it over to our presenters. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Amanda, and thank you all for joining us today. We're really happy to be presenting. So the learning objectives for today's webinar are to define cultural competence and talk about why it's important. We want to provide strategies for assessing cultural responsiveness among staff and clients. We want to provide strategies for implementing a culturally responsive program and strategies for enhancing cultural responsiveness in programs. You'll notice today, as we discuss these strategies, we'll be giving some detailed examples relevant to working with tribal populations. But most of the strategies we will be discussing can be used with other populations served by our reentry programs. We recognize that all reentry programs and the clients they serve are unique and multidimensional. And it's our hope after today's webinar that we'll all be more intentional about responsively evaluating and serving all clients regardless of race, ethnicity, religion, sexuality, etc. So RTI International and the Center for Court Innovations, or CCI, have worked together to produce 3 briefs in our racial equity series. They are the Cultural Responsiveness Brief, Racial Equity and Recidivism, and Risk Assessment and Racial Bias. Today, we're only going to be focusing on the Cultural Responsiveness Brief, but we do encourage you to look at all of the briefs on the National Resource Reentry Center's website. Amanda's going to link that in the chat for us. Thank you for that, Amanda. So what is cultural responsiveness? Cultural responsiveness is the provision of services with sensitivity and integration of beliefs, norms, and values of clients' cultural backgrounds. It involves learning from and relating respectfully to people across cultures. And one size does not fit all. Programs and evaluations need to be responsive to clients of diverse backgrounds and cultures to be effective.
I believe you're on mute.
Sorry about that, folks. Culturally responsive programs address your clients' populations, varied beliefs, practices, and cultures through respectful and inclusive approaches. When we have Native American clients in our programs, it is essential to consider their tribal connections as they are citizens of tribal nations. Therefore, it requires learning how to work with their respective tribes. Working with tribes begins with understanding tribal sovereignty. Although Native Americans are thought of as minorities, tribal sovereignty distinguishes us because of the inherent authority and delegated authority tribes have as governments. Tribes are self-governing. They regulate their own internal affairs. It's an important aspect to understand in helping create a safe pathway home for returning people to their homelands. States have no authority to regulate activities on reservations without a federal grant of power, as occurred with the passage of Public Law 280, giving states concurrent authority over crimes committed on tribal lands. There are over 300 tribes under PL 280 jurisdiction, which makes it essential for state programs to work with tribes for reentry programming. Also, Congress has the authority to limit tribal sovereignty, as occurred with the Major Crimes Act in the 1880s. This act extended concurrent federal jurisdiction over 14 major crimes occurring on tribal lands. Hence, federal prosecution and sentencing of Native Americans into federal prisons, again pointing out the need for federal reentry programs to work with tribes.
What does the literature say about cultural responsiveness and reentry programs? While cultural responsiveness research is highly prevalent in other fields like healthcare, education, and social work, it is scarce in criminal justice. Some studies have shown that culturally responsive programming or cultural engagement in correctional or supervision settings contribute to lower recidivism for Indigenous peoples. Culturally responsive treatment programs may also have positive outcomes, and some studies have shown that standard treatment programs may contribute to increasing disparities in outcomes when comparing white and Black people in correctional settings. Research and evaluation activities can play a critical role in assessing the cultural responsiveness of programs and identifying strategies for improving it. To do this, researchers must themselves engage in certain practices that ensures that their evaluation is culturally responsive, like some of the ones listed here. Researchers must first ensure that members of the evaluation team show cultural competence for the context of each evaluation. They can select or create data collection instruments that have been vetted or validated for use with the populations of interest. They can also engage in critical reflection on assumptions about what valid and meaningful and reliable data actually means and where it comes from. And they can consult and involve the groups who are the focus of the evaluation in the design or analysis or the interpretation of the evaluation. Evaluators must also recognize that different stages or components of the evaluation might require different or new culturally appropriate strategies, and they can tailor their reporting and dissemination to different audiences, including both stakeholders and community members. So today we will discuss strategies for assessing cultural responsiveness first, and then strategies for enhancing it. To assess cultural responsiveness, researchers must first identify the different racial, ethnic, and cultural groups reflected in the client population. For example, some programs may predominantly serve Black or Hispanic communities. Another program might serve predominantly a white rural population, or some services may be tailored to certain subgroups such as women. Reviewing or analyzing existing demographic and client data is an important way to do this. Evaluators can work to ensure that programs are capturing data that may not be typical but are still important for addressing client needs, such as LGBTQ+ identity, ability status, religion, or other relevant characteristics. Our second strategy here is learning about client perceptions, experiences, and needs directly from clients, such as through surveys and focus groups. And in a minute, I'll provide an example of that. Researchers can also explore program engagement and program effectiveness for different subgroups of the program participants. They can assess diversity and perspectives in the reentry program staff, and they can review program components and services with an eye for appropriateness for the client population. So this slide presents some sample questions that could be used in a survey to assess how the program may or may not be cultural responsive. These questions are also available in our brief. So if you look up the cultural responsiveness brief, you'll get a hard copy of these. For example, these survey questions ask about staff interest and respect for the person's cultural identity, whether the program is helping them connect to their culture or community, and whether people feel supported and respected. Keep in mind that surveys are not the only way to get feedbacks from clients on cultural responsiveness, and depending on the population, other data collection strategies may be more important for different groups. One strategy that I mentioned previously was assessing staff diversity and perspectives. Staff may be predominantly from one social or cultural group, and clients may be from a completely different one. And evaluators can help programs assess how their staff members' backgrounds and experiences reflect those of the client population. This can be done by using questions such as those presented on the slide. Are there staff members with relevant lived experience? Do staff members have diverse educational background? Do staff have prior experience with mental health or substance use issues among their family and friends? And do staff members live in neighborhoods similar to those of their clients? They can also assess staff knowledge and views on organizational cultural responsiveness through anonymous staff surveys, assessing knowledge, skills, behaviors, and attitudes.
So becoming fully competent in multiple cultures is a big task and sometimes not feasible. A more realistic goal is to become culturally informed by using strategies and tools that collect meaningful information. Something like a tribal profile tool. You can add information as needed and use it whenever the need presents itself. For example, tribal profiles of your clientele's tribes makes it easier to access information when you have clients from many tribes. The slide lists a few basic topical fields and subfields to consider to begin a tribal profile. Some of the items are tribal demographics. It's important maybe to just know about the size and population, where a tribe is located, the economic factors. Government structure might be very important in terms of helping your client reestablish their connection to the tribe and what protocols might be needed to follow. An important thing is to just know what the justice system looks like. And one of the most important things is to find out what the allied services that might exist in a tribe, because most of the people coming in may need to rely on those resources to help them. Another are cultural-based resources, how to get in touch with spiritual leaders or healers. Becoming culturally informed also means learning how to use tribal culture as a resource. And if you have the information, you're more likely to use culture as a resource. It can involve including knowledgeable Native experts for guidance to help with establishing tribal engagement strategies. Oftentimes we have worked with tribes all over the country, and it's important for us to be able to know how to behave in that community or with that tribe. And so it's useful to have Native experts to help you or to sponsor you in, and sometimes to even help you with data collection. Another thing that's very important to understand is this very strong movement that's going on in tribal communities and tribal nations all across the country. Data sovereignty is relevant for everyone, but it's especially relevant for tribes because of the past abuses with research that has been experienced by tribes. Nowadays, tribes are vigilant about how studies such as research, evaluation, assessments involving tribes and tribal citizens occur. Tribes' experience with studies is an example of becoming culturally or tribally informed. Tribes now require approval of studies. Participants, they want to be able to participate in studies, so participatory strategies are very important, as is tribal involvement. It requires evaluations to include these strategies, such as the ones listed in the slide. For instance, tribal sponsorships, creating allies, doing tribal outreach and awareness, which is one of the main abuses that occurred. Sometimes research occurred or evaluations occurred without the people knowing what was going on. Currently, there are many tribes that require IRBs or have their own IRBs or provide research permits. A lot also require for you to have tribal staff on your evaluations, to also be your interviewers or interpreters, to seek comment on evaluation reports and to make sure their input is included. And then also to be able to partner with tribal experts on how to present findings back to the tribes. These are all things that would make your study or your evaluations more successful, and for tribes to be able to use that information that you uncover.
So we've talked about a number of strategies to assess cultural responsiveness. We're now going to transition into enhancing the cultural responsiveness. We've identified 4 strategies for enhancing cultural responsiveness that you see on the screen there. They include building a culturally responsive oversight of your SCA program and evaluation activities, adapting program components as needed to ensure cultural responsiveness, prioritize hiring staff with diverse backgrounds or lived experience, and improving organizational and staff capacity to provide culturally responsive, trauma-informed services. So we obviously know all of the reentry programs are serving formerly incarcerated clients, and we're hoping everyone has been trained to work with this vulnerable population. But we also want to draw attention to other subgroups who are often further marginalized, in particular when they are the minority. So do you have clients who are LGBTQ, Muslim, learning or physically disabled, homeless, or illiterate maybe? If so, we want to encourage you to assess your staff's capacity to effectively engage, support, and serve those clients as well. And if you find gaps, make a commitment to invest time and resources into training and coaching if needed. Since we're limited on time today, I'm going to provide some details on a few of the recommendations you see. But again, for additional details on all of these strategies, you can see the brief that was linked in our chat. So one of our strategies for achieving cultural responsive oversight in your program involves creating or reimagining an existing advisory board. For this board, we suggest including staff, current or former clients, example, recent graduates, and community members from the client community. If a similar advisory board currently exists, we suggest conducting a systematic review of this board to ensure that all interested and impacted parties are equally represented and engaged. Share the results of your assessment activities with the board to get their feedback on high priority adaptations or modifications. Engage with this board early on and regularly throughout the grant period, and leverage the board to inform programmatic strategies and research and evaluation activities. A community or advisory board can also be a helpful outlet or a safe sounding board on issues related to cultural responsivity and provide a level of accountability that may be difficult to otherwise achieve. Importantly, this board can provide guidance on both programmatic and evaluation activities to ensure the success of each. And for those of you who may already have a board but need some ideas on keeping people engaged and committed, we have a few suggestions in the brief that include providing childcare and meals during meetings if possible, compensating board members for their time, making mentoring available for new board members, and establishing clear goals and plans and also timelines in order to avoid wasted time or ineffective work. Another strategy to enhance cultural responsivity is to prioritize hiring staff with diverse backgrounds or lived experience. This is especially important if an advisory board is not doable. So this is obviously something many organizations are taking a look at, especially over the last couple of years, and we know it's not a quick fix. As you can see, we have 5 recommendations with our programs in mind that include recruiting through non-traditional outlets, such as community centers and other organizations, as well as recruiting from former clients, existing staff, and board members. Reviewing hiring criteria to account for lived experience, possibly in lieu of some educational criteria if possible. Consider adopting a ban-the-box policy if you've not already done so in your organization. These policies provide applicants a fair chance at employment by removing conviction and arrest history questions from job applications and delaying background checks until later in the hiring process. Consider hiring a client who has successfully completed the program, especially those who may have been natural mentors to others who have strong professional skill sets. Train existing staff on best practices and staff supervision, management, and working collaboratively as the staff grows and diversifies. Consider reverse mentoring as a strategy for building cultural competence among program leadership. Consider how new staff members will fit into the decision-making process, ensuring that a diverse hire will not be a valued addition in name only and maximize opportunities for their growth. We didn't have this on the slide, but we also believe that just simply adding a few diverse candidates to the staff is just not enough. We know staff are going to need ongoing support, particularly for those who may be working in this area for the first time, and would encourage staff to be mindful and intentional in providing that support. In the cultural responsiveness brief we've mentioned, we introduced the concept of reverse mentoring, and this is where a senior staff person or maybe a board member receives or connects with and receives feedback and guidance from a more junior staff member or a program participant even who has lived experience that the senior staff person does not. In the interest of time, I won't go into the specifics of that type of program, but would encourage you again to review the brief. And if you have additional questions about how to get started with a reverse mentoring program, we will put our email address in the notes, and I'd be happy to go over that with you individually.
So evaluations of reentry programs need to include elements relevant to Native American clients. When programs indicate services to Native American clients, evaluations should include questions that describe the culturally responsive service offerings that the programs provide. It should include questions about the way services are accessed or marketed to Native clientele, and questions about the inclusion of tribal-based or cultural-based resources. I usually distinguish between these two, as tribal-based services generally come from the tribal government, and cultural-based are from the tribe's culture. As noted earlier, tribes' inherent authority clearly indicates the need to work with tribes, mainly to create clear and informed pathways home to Native American clients to restore or regain their tribal-based and cultural-based privileges.
As we said earlier, there's really not enough research and work done in criminal justice around culturally responsive programs. This is definitely an area that sites and evaluators will likely need support with. Our brief includes a compilation of numerous resources from different fields or specialized areas like substance use treatment and education. Some of those resources are particularly useful when thinking about evaluation, including culturally responsive evaluation and equitable evaluation. We want to thank all of you for joining us today, and we welcome any questions in the chat or in the Q&A box, I guess.
Yes, thank you, Alma. Please feel free to put any questions that you have for our presenters today in the Q&A box. We have had a couple questions on if today's presentation will be shared. And yes, it is being recorded, and we will also disseminate a PDF of the presentation materials, as well as a link to the resources that have been referenced with that archive as well. So one question we have received: if I'm leading an evaluation with small numbers of people from different tribes, how will the approval process work? Ada, I'll toss that question to you.
Okay, so a good marker for that is to decide whether or not you should get tribal approval really depends on where where the evaluation is occurring. If you're including the tribe's involvement, then definitely you need to have tribal approval. So if you have clients that you are including in the evaluation, maybe you're doing a survey with them or doing an interview with them, but they don't live on the reservation or their tribal lands or their tribal jurisdiction, then you probably don't need to get tribal approval. Once that study is being, and it doesn't matter how many, I think, I would say that if you're going to try to interview people that are living on tribal lands or tribal jurisdictions, then you must have tribal approval. Otherwise, I think that, you hear about studies including American Indians, Alaska Natives, but most of the time, it's because they're living off tribal lands or in non-native communities. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you for that response, Ada. We received another question. What should the program to serve small numbers of tribal populations prioritize in cultural responsiveness?
So again, I think one of the slides that you saw, I think it's the second to the last one, I put on there some things that are pretty important to people that are incarcerated still or are trying to work in a program, and that has to do with being able to access tribal-based or cultural-based spiritual or religious services. Traditional counseling from people who are from the person's tribe, and also healing resources. These, I think, are very important items to include in a program that serves Native Americans. The other thing is that I think it's really important, as I mentioned, to be able to learn how to help a person reestablish their good citizen standing. Because this really goes to the inherent authority that tribes have. They control the internal activities in the tribe. And so if a person returning to a tribal community needed, for instance, land, they might need to be able to reestablish themselves as a good citizen in order to be able to regain that privilege of acquiring land. Even being able to participate in ceremonial events might be another thing that they would require. And just accessing resources that are available to citizens living on tribal lands. Again, that safe pathway home is a very important aspect, and people that have been disconnected from their homelands for a long period of time, they might need to relearn how that happens, or to have some sponsorship from a tribal person, a tribal, what we've been calling experts, or somebody that works for the tribe to help that person reestablish their citizenship and their good standing in tribes, in their tribal community.
Thank you so much for that response. Monica, for you, how do you balance the need for hiring people who have a need for lived experience if people have been incarcerated?
So that's a great question, and one that we've certainly received in the past. So I'll say most of the folks on here are from our reentry programs, but for those who don't know, most correctional facilities require background checks for anyone who comes into the facility as a visitor or volunteer. And obviously that can affect staff who have previous charges. But I would say that all of our program staff, they're in a unique position that most of you really have a solid and mutually beneficial working relationship with the staff at your local jail or detention facility. And so I would suggest that you leverage that relationship and ask the warden or the facility administrator to make an exception. We would, I would suggest that you would, in that formal request, note the staff person's accomplishments since being released from incarceration or supervision, and highlight what you think that person's presence on your team would mean, not only for the program, but for future clients and ultimately the programming at the jail. I mean, people deserve second chances, right? The jail obviously is on board with that. They've allowed you all to come in. So now it's time to think, are you all really behind the notion of and the commitment for reentry? And if so, how much time needs to pass before someone could work in the space and be able to get back? So I think essentially I would say that you're going to need to advocate for the staff person just like you would your clients, and ask them to make an exception and allowing them to be considered to come into the facilities. It's just because those rules are in place, it doesn't mean that people can't make exceptions, and we've often seen them do that on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you for that response, Monica. Lama, how can we get buy-in from our program leadership or funders for investing in strategies to make our program and evaluation more culturally responsive?
Thanks, Amanda. This is also, I think, a really common challenge in terms of trying to assess and implement culturally responsive strategies in terms of program leadership buy-in or funder buy-in. So a definite starting point is some of the strategies discussed in our brief for assessing cultural responsiveness. And that would include taking a look at your existing statistics on your client population to even just determine what your cultural diversity is among your clients and see what groups are represented. If you have that information or need to make or feel like you have a good understanding of the cultural diversity in your client population, you can work with your evaluator to try and explore whether there's any existing evidence out there that shows that cultural responsiveness is a more effective strategy with that group. It's also possible that you'll have to collect new information to help support the argument for culturally responsive programming. And I think it's really important, of course, to engage with program leaders and funders on this topic and talk about the cultural diversity of your client population and the needs and maybe additional services that are needed to meet those needs. And, sort of building off some of what Ada said, you could also try to build relationships. If you have Native American clients and have to build relationships with local tribes, you can engage program leadership and funders in that process as well, so that those relationships are well established and influential in both directions. And those are, I think, a few ideas to help build buy-in. There's probably a lot more out there, and what we're happy to discuss further if people want to talk about it.
I just want to add to what Lama said, and this is something that we put in the brief. I think it's important when we're talking to anyone, but in particular, I'm talking about tribes. Sometimes when we talk to tribes, they give us a lot of information, but a lot of times that information isn't reflected in the work that's being done. And this happens even in evaluation. So a tribe might tell you all kinds of things that they would like to see or have included in the services or in the evaluation, and then they walk away and none of that is used. So it's really important to be very genuine when you do talk to people, that you don't ignore what they've given you, and that you have very deliberate ways of showing them how you're using the information that they've shared with you, especially when they're very concerned about things that have not gone right in the past. And because this will give your work credibility, and it would encourage people to use the results of your evaluations by the programs and by the people that you're serving.
Thank you so much for that. We do still have plenty of time for Q&A. Please feel free to include any questions or comments that you may have for our presenters in the Q&A pod. I'll pause briefly to give folks a little bit of time to input any more questions. At this time, I'm not seeing any additional questions come in through the chat or the Q&A pod. But before I do start to close this out and wrap up with our poll questions for today, I do want to give each of our presenters an opportunity to share any final words or comments on today's webinar.
Thanks, Amanda. I'll just say it was great getting an opportunity to present some of this information. It's a lot to digest, particularly depending on where you're at with your program. So I would just encourage everyone to look at the brief when you get a chance and to check in with your site coach for a one-on-one conversation and maybe to talk through some of the strategies for assessing or enhancing that maybe weren't super clear or that you just feel like you could just use a more in-depth conversation. And we are certainly here to support you on this and all topics, and I look forward to talking to you about it again.
Ada, I'll let you have the last word. But I'll just jump in and say, yeah, it's been a pleasure to develop this brief. I hope it's useful to reentry programs. And if you have any questions, I don't know if it's already been shared in the chat, Amanda, but if you can share the ESTA general email, I think that'll be a great resource for folks if they want to dive into any aspects of this and reach our teams. But I hope that sites and reentry programs can try to prioritize this work. Even though it's challenging, it helps put into practice some of the values that I think we all agree on. And so I encourage you all to dive into the brief and the other 2 briefs in this series and try to implement as little or as much as possible of this as you can. Thank you all.
I would just like to add that I think it's really important for everyone to be able to not be afraid to include the service recipients, the clients themselves. I know that we've described it as the people that have the lived experience. And I think this is very applicable to tribes because when we think about being culturally relevant, culturally competent, tribes are the best people to ask. Well, what does that mean? Because it can be an abstract thing for a lot of us that are not from the different tribal communities that are out there. We don't know everything about them. So it's really important that we are not afraid to ask them. I always say to people that sometimes, I come from a tribe that we're the only people that speak our language. So no one can certify us to be, to certify that we're speaking our language. We self-certify ourselves. And so when I think about that with other tribes, it's very important then that we engage them and have them be our guides so that we do the best possible evaluations that we can. And I think nowadays tribes are very open to that kind of partnership, and we should not be afraid to include that information or to ask for that information. So I encourage all of you to reach out to the tribal people out there that your clients are from. And also, your clients will really appreciate that you made the effort to learn about who they are and where they come from. And I think that this is probably applicable to everyone that we're talking about here, that to be culturally responsive for everyone. Everyone has a culture. And so I think these are the kinds of things that we're trying to push here for people to be able to include those elements in the work that you're doing. And no one more than the three of us on this panel and that the people that we work for appreciate all the work that you do. This is not easy work a lot of times, and it's hard to maintain or establish relationships, but without you, things won't get better. And so thank you so much for all the work that you do, and we hope that the briefs that have been put together in this webinar have been helpful for you. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for such an informative webinar. Before we move into our final poll questions, I just wanted to reiterate again that your ESTA site coaches are available to assist with more individualized work on the topic presented today. If you have questions or thoughts on how to apply the content to your work, please don't hesitate to reach out to your site coach. And I've also included our project email address in the chat if you want to reach out that way as well. So Shane, if you don't mind pulling up our final poll questions. If everyone could just take a moment to answer these poll questions, we would greatly appreciate your feedback. This feedback is used to report on our performance as part of our BJA funding. As you are answering these poll questions, I do have 2 additional questions that I would like for you to consider, and type any feedback or responses that you have into the chat pod or the Q&A pod. If you type your responses into the Q&A pod, there is an option to make your response anonymous. So the first question is, how could this webinar be improved? If you have ideas or recommendations for improving the webinar, please feel free to share those suggestions with us. The second question I would like for you to consider is if there are any topics that you would like to see covered in future webinars. If you have topics you would like to see, share those ideas in the chat pod or in the Q&A pod. So again, those questions are, how could this webinar be improved? And are there any topics that you would like to see covered in future webinars? Thank you, Shane, for including those in the chat as well. So we'll give folks just a few more moments to respond to the survey. We greatly appreciate you all taking the time to provide your feedback. It looks like we're getting some good suggestions and questions through the chat. Thank you all so much for that. Again, thank you so much to our presenters for sharing their knowledge today. And thank you all so much for taking the time to spend with us and learn more about cultural responsiveness this afternoon. If you have any questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to reach out. Again, you can reach out to your ESTA site coach or to the ESTA TTA team through the email address provided in the chat. Thank you all so much, and I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon.